Hey guys, in this video, I'm going to give you a very brief history of U.S. statutes regulating immigration from Europe, Africa, and Asia, and how the history got us to where we are today. Before 1875, there were essentially no federal laws restricting migration to the U.S. other than the 1808 ban on the slave trade. The basic rule of the pre-1875 period is that almost anyone who wanted to come to the U.S. could come. Just get in a boat and show up. There were no legal mechanisms to stop you. What changed that was huge anti-Chinese prejudice, in particular on the West Coast. Congress began to pass laws restricting immigration from China in 1862, 1875. This led up to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, which was the country's first large-scale restriction on immigration, essentially banning the entry of any Chinese except for a small number of the wealthy. That was followed by a 1907 agreement with Japan, limiting migration from that country. In 1917, Congress passed legislation banning entry by folks from most of the rest of Asia. With all that in place, though, until the 1920s, for the first 150 years of this nation's history, there was no significant legal restriction on the ability of a white person anywhere in the world to move here. Sometimes in debates over immigration, you'll hear a white person mention that his family, unlike many current migrants, came here legally. But until the 1920s, if you weren't East Asian, that was really easy to do. You just came. That changed with passage of the National Origins Act in 1924. The 1924 Act was driven by prejudice against Southern and Eastern European immigrants in general, and Italians and Jews in particular. By the 1920s, the locus of immigration had changed. The new immigrants, overwhelmingly, were the Northern and Western Europeans who ran the country. There were Southern and Eastern Europeans who were seen as unassimilable and mentally and physically inferior. The 1924 Act addressed this by assigning to each country a yearly quota. As the numbers worked out, Germany got 51,000 slots per year. Great Britain and Ireland together got 63,000. So those three countries among them had 114,000 slots per year, but Russia got 2,200, Italy got 3,800 per year, Spain got 130, Greece got 100, all of Africa got 1,200. So under this new plan, we weren't just limiting immigration from Asia. We were allowing in up to 140,000 fair-skinned people per year from Northwest Europe and Scandinavia, and about 20,000 people from the entire rest of the world. In 1965, Congress enacted a new law, the Immigration Act of 65, repealing both the national origin system and the limitations on entry by natives of Asian countries. It's important to understand, though, what we got rid of then and what we kept. We lost the explicit racism and the preferences for some countries over others. Under the new system, every country in the world gets 20,000 slots per year. This led to a really big increase, post-65, in the proportion of the immigrant pool coming from Asian countries. But we didn't lose the other feature of the 1924 law, which was the idea of a sharp numerical limitation on who could enter the U.S. Pre-1924, immigration to the U.S. from Europe and Africa was limited only by the number of people who wanted to come. After 1924, and continuing through 1965 through to today, there are sharp numerical limits. Once the yearly immigration quota is hit, that's it. And so the 1965 Act set up so-called preference categories to determine who would go to the front of the line every year. Started with close relatives of U.S. citizens, so on. If you didn't fall into one of those preference categories by virtue of being a close family member of a U.S. citizen or of a lawful permanent resident or a worker in an occupation for which there was insufficient labor supply in the U.S., or a refugee from a communist country or the Middle East, then you fell in the last catch-all category for everybody else. Then it became clear by 1978 that nobody in the everybody else category was getting in. There were just too many people ahead of them. So Congress in 1990 eliminated the everybody else category. That gave us the rules we have now. There are yearly limits on immigration into the U.S. both from any given country and overall. And not only that, without regard to those, you can't immigrate unless you fall into one of the explicit categories set out in the statutes. Those are the rules that govern us today.